Ahunna Eziakonwa, thank you for talking to Joy News. You are joining scores of private and public actors for the AfriExim's annual meeting for this year, 2023, which is being hosted here in Accra. I was just looking at the theme for the event, which talks about delivering the vision and also building prosperity for Africans. Let me first of all take your thoughts on the theme and the reflection that has gone on from the start of the event to where we are now, rounding off activities. Do you first of all feel that the continent is positioned to deliver prosperity to its citizens?
Thank you, Blessed, and thanks for having me on Joy News. I think, the theme itself is quite interesting because this is a continent where the subject has always been about poverty and tackling poverty and misery and wars, and it's really important to shift our minds to prosperity and a promise, looking at Africa through a different lens. And this is what we've been preaching at UNDP, that for you to actually position any region for development, you need to first build in the self-confidence, you need to be positive, and you need to invest in opportunity and hope. And I think it was just the right title to choose. Are we positioned to achieve prosperity on the continent? Yeah. I think that depends on a lot of things. One, I think actually the Africa Continental Free Trade Area positions the continent to achieve prosperity because for the first time, Africa will be able to trade with itself and also increase its competitiveness in trading with the world. The share of Africa's trade with the rest of the world and within Africa is low. So if we are to really implement the AfCFTA and make it inclusive, I think that's a great positioning. Another thing that positions Africa is its youthful population. In the rest of the world, we have declining, the age levels are going higher, and you have an aging population out there. Africa is probably the only region that offers the future of development and labor. So that also positions the continent quite well.
And in fact, the youth bulge comes with its own challenges for the continent. We'll talk about that shortly. But I was asking about the positioning because of where we find ourselves as a continent that was worst hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, not necessarily because of the virus, but because of the economic shocks that we received. And the latest is also the Russian-Ukraine war and the disruptions in the food supply chain. Do you feel that Africa can build back better and to be more resilient going into the future?
Africa definitely can build back better, and that is the approach, I think, because if you just imagine for a second what happened during COVID, where we had the lockdown and supply chains disappeared. We realized that Africa was dependent on the rest of the world for 70% of what it needed to sustain life, whether it was in the form of medicines or food. That is a shocking, rude awakening, isn't it? That you then say to yourself, what if this happens again, right? Where will the continent look? So it really woke up many governments and also those in private sector to realize that we have to produce locally. So the structural transformation that we've been preaching for years that's never really materialized can now become a thing. It is now the subject of every policy conversation. How can Africa increase its productivity? How can we make our supply and productive chains resilient? How can we mobilize resources domestically, and how can we increase our productivity and be able to export so that you can also earn currency? But above all, how do we transition from just exporting raw materials to adding value to our products so that you can also create jobs at home? So the whole industrialization issue has suddenly become a major priority in Africa's capital.
And yet what we see is that many governments are shifting priority, maybe because of the exigencies of the time. external factors affecting many of our economies, and experts are equally worried that there's a debt crisis looming because of the approach many governments have taken over the years. Are you equally worried that this may affect
the debt issue,
the desire to produce locally, as you're pointing to?
The debt issue is a problem, and it needs to be tackled. And this is why at the UN we're calling for really a reform, if you like, of the global financial architecture. Because if you see what happened during COVID, where did the money go to rescue stimulus money? It didn't go to countries that needed it most. For instance, the special drawing rights that the IMF released, only 33 billion came to Africa. It was 600 billion, right, in size. So there is a kind of an unfair formula out there for how you address financial crises when they occur. Those who have less seem to get less, and this needs to be turned around. So of course, African countries need to deal with the present risks and threats to their population, whether it's occasioned by climate change or the impact of the war in Ukraine, which is bringing imported inflation. You can't let your population just go to waste and suffer. You need to find measures to alleviate the pain. And that, of course, disrupts the investment in the future of development, right, in the development trajectory. So that's an issue. But there are ways to make finances cheaper for the continent. That's something we have to look at. And we've been looking at it at UNDP, for instance. We just did a study on the cost of borrowing, right, and the credit rating bias that puts African countries at a disadvantage. If we can deal with that, you save $75 billion a year for just 16 countries that we surveyed.
Are you saying this is becoming a reality? Because our president raised that during the AfriExim meetings, where there's this continental push for our own standards and ratings. Is that the solution to the problem?
That's part of the solution. I mean, you will always have to participate in the international rating agencies because they have a standard.
Because we can't do without them.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think that you can influence how they rate Africa, and it comes back to the perceptions. A lot of it is really perceptions. I mean, there are facts and there's a reality that you have insecurity in some cases and you have foreign exchange volatility in other cases. Yeah, don't get me wrong. There are reasons why all of these ratings are as bad as they are in some cases. But, it's not taking into account all the data, and it's also not always objective. Some of it is subjective. We know that there is, this country, Ghana, is surrounded by countries that are in violent extremism situations. So it must be risky, to invest in Ghana. No, don't do that. Take Ghana in its own right in terms of what it has to offer and what its potential is, and do that rating based on some objective data, right? And if you did that, many African countries will not end up in the junk basket, and that will help also increase investments, because if you look at the ratings, investors also are put out, yes, right?
But I don't intend to dwell on that. The concern here is that if you look at the facts on the ground and compare them to the ratings that we have, and I'll use Ghana for example because we're here, we're heading for an austerity plan with the IMF, for instance. That's a reality. We're out of the market, and it's because of some policy measures that did not go right. So where's the bias really that you're pointing to?
Well, if you look at and the credit rating agencies themselves will also tell you that they could use more data that is available elsewhere, and that's what we're proposing. That there's econometrics data that sometimes is not factored in. African countries themselves need to pay attention when they are rated. They need to review the reports, and they need to put some resources into ensuring that they bring all the information that's required, that could perhaps influence where that rating goes. So there are things to do to reduce the bias in the rating. There is bias in the rating. We've established that. But there is also a problem with Africa's policies and policy orientation. I think we're talking more and more about policy sovereignty, that we need agency in the policy environment. We need African countries that are able to own their own policies and be accountable for it. So you're accountable to your people in terms of what regulations and policies you're adopting and how they're impacting the lives of the populations, not accountable to someone else out there, right? So yes, it's a balance.
Let's feed this into what you do broadly. Of course, as part of your activities, you ensure that the SDGs are pushed across the continent, and it was striking for me to realize that as part of your findings, you noticed that 9 out of 10 women across the continent face biases. It's a challenge because if you look at economies across the continent, and here in Ghana, for instance, it is women that are known to be the backbone of our economies due to how largely informal they are. How can we promote inclusivity or inclusiveness for more women to be a part of the economy and to feel that they could also influence some change?
Brilliant question, especially coming from a man. I think it's really crucial, and it's an existential issue for Africa, right? Because we're going nowhere unless we deal with the gender biases that we see on this continent, whether it's in the political sphere, the economic sphere, or the social sphere. Why is it important? It's important because it's not just in terms of the calculations, the rights issue. It's important because it's a rights issue. Every woman has a right to have equal access to what the other gender has. But it's also important in terms of economics. We did a study a few years ago that showed that Africa was losing close to $90 billion a year as a result of gender inequality, as a result of not empowering its women. This is serious.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it and the needs that we have today. So it's a win-win situation, right? And the case is made for promoting this. But there are lots of challenges around this, They exist in the realm of the social and cultural. People just not used to seeing women in leadership positions, for instance, and then not believing that a woman in a political leadership position can make changes and can do it, right? So we need to push and insist that women participate in political life, that they have opportunities to be elected, not just appointed, and that is a thing of cultural shift. And then we need to look at the economic sphere. Today we're talking about AFCFTA, right? If we make the face of AFCFTA feminine, I think we will get further, because who is doing the cross-border trades? Who are the market women that you see across the world? And when women are successful in their business, what happens? The rest of the social sectors benefit. A woman who is in business and is successful, the first thing they do, they invest in their children's education. They invest in their health. They invest in their nutrition. So it's really important to trigger support for women in all the spheres: political, economic, and social.
I see that you're passionate about the Continental Free Trade Area. We'll talk about that briefly, but of course, you look at policy measures such as the affirmative action bill here in Ghana, which has taken so long for us to push. These are some policy measures, for instance, that are making it difficult to cause that change. Do you feel that some other forms of activism should take place just to push, the points that you're making, that women must be given the opportunity to have a seat at the table and to influence change?
Absolutely. I mean, let's look at what other countries, actually advanced countries, have done this. If you look at countries across Europe, many of them today have a feminist policy. Canada, Sweden, Germany, and they are appointing women in top positions because they have seen that sustaining their development and their future depends on it. And I think Africa should pay attention to the importance of this variable. As I said, it's an existential issue. But there is need for more activism, but there's also need for more pragmatism, that we need to ensure that girls are going to school and staying in school. And that, you know, issues around science and technology and leveraging digitalization will not exclude girls. That, you know, we're having STEM activities constantly invested in women as well, especially in young women. We need to make sure that families are getting the right orientation, not to constrain their girl children, right? And I think it's important. So the fundamentals are important to establish, as well as the policy environment.
A key tool to spur on growth, as experts are pointing to, is the Continental Free Trade Area. And you were saying that we need to make it a bit more feminine. I'll get your explanation to that shortly. But even the policy itself is off to a slow pace start. We were seeing now what is a shadow form of the framework itself, the guided trade, which is happening amongst Ghana and 7 other countries. But looking at the Continental Free Trade Area itself, do you feel that the vision is feasible in the first place?
The vision, if the vision is feasible, absolutely. I mean, I think it's so for me so far, it's the best thing that's happened to Africa in the last decade, right? That, you know, there isn't an example that we know where a region, a continent, a country succeeded without somehow having some economic integration within that region, whether it's Europe, Asia, Latin America. That is a big factor in engendering prosperity. So is it feasible on the continent? Absolutely. But it's not only feasible, it's necessary for Africa because of the way the structure of our economies are. We have very small countries, and then we have a few very large countries. And there are some countries that will just not survive unless they're able to trade across their borders, right? So we need to do this. There is some impatience around it, and I think that's good. That's good tension. I think journalists should be asking the question, are we going fast enough? Because we're not. We need to go faster because of the imperatives that we're facing right now, the poly crisis that's there. And we know that if we slow down on the implementation of this, we have fewer cards to play in dealing with this crisis. But also, this could be a zone where we tackle inequality. So if AfCFTA is fully inclusive, we can begin to address issues of inequality. That's why we don't want it to be an afterthought about how do women benefit from it. And upfront, we want to bring the voices and experiences of women to the center.
But do you see that happening right now?
Yes, we see it happening. You know, we participated with another agency, UN Women, in consulting women traders across 27 countries 2 years ago to ask them, how do they want to benefit from this? What are their issues? And we assembled all the thoughts from that, and it got into a report which we call the Engine of Trade, how we empower women in the trade and facilitate trade for women. And this will now influence the protocol on women and youth in trade, which is critical for AfCFTA. The regulations are important. If we can recognize, first of all, that women need to be facilitated in terms of financing. You know, they need the financing to grow their businesses, and they need that capital.
They need the capital.
Yes. And that they need information. This was another thing that they said. I mean, it's simple, right? You say, how do you share information with a constituency that is largely informal, for instance, because that's what that's where most women are, is in the formal sector. And so if you're not counted, you're not benefiting from a lot of things. So first we need to formalize a lot of women businesses, so they can get that information and they can build networks. And then we need to make them export ready. What does it mean? Ensure they have the capacity to improve the standard of their products, ensure that they have the business to business networks that allow them to gauge their competitiveness and their opportunities. So there's a lot of practical steps that can be taken to make a difference. Fortunately, the problem isn't the lack of enthusiasm or talent by the women who are involved in trade. They are hugely experienced. We don't have to teach them that much, right? It's just the facilitation, the technology, access to markets, networks, mentoring that we need to add.
Are you not leaving out the issue about a single currency, which would make trading faster for these women?
No, this is part of the equation, and that's why the meeting we came to here with Afreximbank has been addressing this. Afreximbank itself, investing in this payment system that allows you to trade in your own currency. I think that's a game changer, and that definitely will facilitate a lot of things in the trade and the businesses of women.
Okay. It may seem that this point is far away from matters relating to the economy, but climate change certainly has an impact on whatever plans we have in terms of our food security, even the economy itself. And so you've been working on that across the continent. Do you see a lot of commitment towards that while we push towards having a one African market, the continental free trade area? Why is it so critical for us not to lose sight of issues relating to climate change? Because it has a bearing on what we're doing now as a continent.
Yes, it does. Africa contributes so little to the global emissions, but it is heavily affected, right, by climate change. So you see, we have to be part of the global conversation. Africa cannot say, we don't care. These things are far away and we're not contributing. You're not contributing that much, but you are feeling the heat, right, and the impact of it. So that's why it's important that we are part of the global conversation around addressing climate change. Of course, our immediate needs are around adaptation. How do you structure Africa's economies and systems to make them more resilient, and populations as well that are being hit hard by the impact of climate change? But also mitigation. We are not yet an industrialized region, but Africa needs to industrialize in order to take care of its people and create jobs and feed its population. We need to add value to our raw materials. All of that will require energy, and some of it could be very carbon heavy. But today, Africa is also developing in the age of technology and new technologies, advanced technologies. How do we leverage all of that to have a greener pathway to development? And I think that's a conversation we should be having. The first imperative is that we need to reduce, actually eliminate energy poverty.
You were in Egypt when, of course, the whole conversation around loss and damage reparations, you know that best. The conversation came up for many of these African countries asking the polluter to pay more. Where's that conversation now, and how do you situate that into the commitment by these African countries towards tackling issues of climate change?
So COP27 was Africa's COP, and I think it was really important that we secured that commitment to loss and damage. And the question now is to unpack it. What does it mean for each Africa? What does it mean for Mozambique? Or for Cameroon, when you have a big flood that wipes out all the development gains that you've made over the years, right? And I believe in the principle of the polluter pays more. So I think it's really important to hold advanced countries that contribute to the lion's share of the pollution to pay for the impact that is having in many countries. So the loss and damage agreement is an important one to ensure that it gets implemented. But then it's also the need to invest in adaptation funds for each country. Africa has really ambitious, nationally determined contributions. We know because we supported governments to develop them. And they have objectives and targets that, if achieved, will make Africa a leading partner in tackling climate change. But they need support, they need to be funded, they need to be financed. Africa should not be expected to borrow money to deal with climate change, in fact, right?
And finally, the Sustainable Development Goals. We're just 7 years plus away from achieving the targets that we've set for ourselves. We know that the ultimate aim is that no one will be left behind. Are we certain that after 7 years, we'll not be sitting back here in Accra again to say, well, some people were left out and we need more work to be done?
It's a challenge. We need a big push to make it happen, because we've had a setback because of COVID and because of the war in Ukraine, and also effects of climate change. So this poorly crisis, it's really a big obstacle for achieving the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So if we're going to overcome them, we need an extra push. You know, we can't do business as usual. And it's quite clear that if we follow the pace that we're going right now, we will not achieve the SDGs by 2030. And that's why the Secretary General is saying, let's have a stimulus, inject $500 billion a year in the most critical sectors in the countries that need that most, and also look at all the environment of debt, for instance, the things that constrain countries from, you know, unleashing their full potential. Let's see if we can ease some of that, you know, like debt restructuring, like the cost of borrowing, as I said earlier. So it's possible, but it's not possible without that push, that extra push.
Well, I'd have to thank you, and I'm sure that you spent some time in Accra and it's been worthwhile.
It has been. Thank you, Blessed. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Nice talking to you.